Okay. Hello. Hello and welcome everyone to the second part of my presentation. And thanks to all of you who are here for making your way to the auditorium so early in the morning. Today I'll sort of take off from where I left off last time. So just to give you a reminder, we are talking about strongly correlated particle systems to provide an alternative paradigm of generating samples as opposed to the classical paradigm of IID sampling. And we looked at various possible applications, and then we looked at the kind of improvements that we can hope for. And then we introduced the key model of strongly correlated particle systems, which enables us to obtain or enables us to do this both in terms of mathematical analysis as well as from the point of view of implementation. And these are determinable point processes or DVPs. So it's the kernel machine of particle systems, if you want to remember one catchphrase about it. And then basically, we characterize determinantal processes by their correlation functions, which are joint probabilities of having points at specified locations, and these are given by determinants. And these naturally entail repulsion. And then we looked at various particular classes of determinantal processes which have significantly strong mathematical properties, and using these orthogonal polynomial kernels, we can do determinantal sampling, which provides you provable guarantee of improvement over IID sampling, and we can even obtain some concentration inequalities in spite of the strong dependence. And we discussed some generalities about the, why, conceptually, why determinantal processes provide us with these improvements. And then we are on to, we discussed a little bit about sampling, which we hope to take up in more detail today. And then we are on to statistical learning theory. So, so what are the key challenges in trying to do statistical learning theory? So in terms of statistical learning theory, you can think of the most vanilla version of results whereby, so you have this concentration result for, let's say, one particular test function. And what you want to do is that you want to, instead of this inequality, what you want is that you want a uniform guarantee over a class of functions. Okay, so that's one of the basic variants of statistical learning results that we can hope for. And then in classical statistical learning theory, there's a huge body of literature and very powerful techniques which have been developed over the years in order to solve these, in order to obtain this kind of uniform guarantees for learning theory problems. So what are the key challenges in trying to do this for strongly correlated samplers like determinantal samplers? So one key aspect of the classical statistical learning theory is that although it is very well developed and sophisticated, it almost exclusively focuses on independent samples. Okay, so this is a crucial bottleneck, and lack of independence of sample points actually creates a huge problem. In particular, even very fundamental techniques from empirical process theory, such as symmetrization, it fails. Because if you try to do symmetrization here, what you will soon find out is that, so the basic premise on which the basic computation upon which the symmetrization technique is based doesn't work if your sample points are not independent. Okay, so this is a major challenge, and the other challenge at this point, which is of relatively minor in nature compared to the first issue, but still, as we slowly crack this first issue, it will become important, which is that concentration phenomena is understood as I illustrated in the theorem which I stated in the previous slide, but it is understood to a limited extent. So I kind of alluded to some of the limits of the concentration inequality that I could show, and these concentration phenomena have also to be investigated and understood much more deeply in order to develop a much better statistical learning theory. And all of these are, I think, excellent and challenging open questions for any interested enthusiast to try their hands at. So what kind of results we do have? So these are the challenges. So in some sense, bad news. So early in the morning, I would like to. It's probably good to share a bit of good news as well. So good news is that we are already making progress in this direction. So, in a paper, in a joint work in progress with my postdoc Zia Udong, PhD student Hong Son Tran and Shah Mendelsohn, we looked at this problem carefully in 1D. Okay, so imagine you are sampling points from a circle, and we are using some canonical orthogonal polynomial based DPP there. And based on that, we get this uniform guarantee, statistical learning guarantee of essentially of the order 1 over m up to log factor, up to a factor of square root log m. And this is clearly better than Gaussian rates because Gaussian, which is standard independent sampling rate, because that will give you a 1 over square root m here. And an important point to compare is to the so-called discrepancy lower bound. So the discrepancy lower bound is basically saying that it's like the gold standard of what is even possible to do in this model. So of course, for those who are technically oriented, there is a slight difference between the discrepancy lower bound and what is here, because here we are taking supremum over a function class that has some basic smoothness. Discrepancy lower bound basically refers to let's say you have the circle. And you are selecting points from it at random. Discrepancy lower bound refers to the following. So pick an interval, let's say I, and you look at and suppose you have picked n points. So you have sharp I points in that interval I, and the fraction of points which lies in that interval is sharp I over n. And the natural thing to compare it is with the sort of the normalized length of this interval. So let's call it I. And let's imagine that the total length of the circle is 1. And then what you do is that you take sup over all intervals I. Okay. So script I is the class of all intervals. Okay. And then the discrepancy bound, it refers to a quantity like this, and it is known from classical discrepancy theory that on the circle, on the unit circle, this lower this is bounded from below by the order 1 over n. And what we are saying here is okay, these things are not exactly the same because we are taking some So for example, you can think of this sharp I, the number of points falling in the interval of I, as you can look at it as lambda m or lambda n, because there are n particles here, of the indicator function of the interval I. Okay. So what you are doing here is that you are taking these lambda n's or lambda m's, depending on how you label the number of particles, over the collection of indicator functions of intervals. And here you are taking somewhat smoother class of functions. But even so, we can almost match the discrepancy lower bound up to log factors. Okay, so this is kind of quite interesting from empirical process. H2 is the Sobolev space. So of course, there is an interesting technical question as you relax the regularity of the space, what price you have to pay here. Right. So there is an interesting technical question as to what happens when you bring down the regularity of the space of functions, but already this requires, a significant amount of technical work. So maybe we will take that up in future follow-up research. Okay. Okay. So let me now switch gears and talk a little bit about parametric statistics in the context, parametric models in the context of DBVs. So first of all, we have spent quite a bit of time in discussing DBPs as an important, as a potentially useful sampling technique, a technique to generate samples. So there, the point of view is that you have a big ground set, or let's say the continuum, you want to generate samples, and then the kernel is under your control. So you design a good kernel and DBP based on that kernel so that you can do fast sampling, which give you a lot of good approximation properties. But you can also think of a situation where the DBP you are using as a statistical model. So for instance, if you have a collection of points which you are trying to model, and you know a priori that there is some kind of repulsion behavior that is going on in the points, and I will come to some examples very soon. So then, of course, in the classical spatial statistics literature, which is a very important application of these kind of ideas. So in spatial statistics, researchers are interested in finding models which can model various different kinds of spatial point patterns, okay? And of course, the classical model is the Poisson point process, and then there are various variants of Poisson point process. For example, you can look at inhomogeneous Poisson point process, and then from there you can go to Cox process and various other kinds of processes which are essentially built upon independence of the points, and then you modify them in various ways to suit your needs. But none of them, because they are fundamentally built on the basis of, on the foundations of statistical independence, none of them can really model strong interactions, repulsion, for example, very well. And therefore, it's reasonable to consider determinantal models as a statistical model for spatial statistics, when you know a priori that some kind of, from the problem description, it is understood a priori that some kind of repulsive behavior between the points should be present. So let me give a classical, let me give a couple of examples. So these examples, these applications often arise in spatial statistics and also in biological data. So what kind of applications? So let me give two examples from spatial statistics. So in spatial statistics, it is often important to model the locations of sort of the collective locations of various objects. So let me give two examples. So one of them is the so-called Spanish towns data set. So in the Spanish towns data set, so you are what you are looking at is that you are looking at the sizes of various towns, okay, in a region in Europe. And it is, I don't have to try too hard to convince you that if you threshold the towns by their population, if you have a big town at a certain location, then it is not very likely that you will have another big town or big city very close to it. So usually they are located in a spatially interspersed way, and then then there are smaller satellite towns which are connected to it, but they are they are different. We are looking at the big cities. So then if you threshold by location, then these sort of big towns with population above a certain threshold, they will naturally have a repulsive behavior for natural logistical reasons, and you want to model. Another example is this so-called Japanese pines data set. And you don't have to go to Japan or consider pine trees. The basic rationale is very simple. The point is that so there is even a saying in English which is something to the tunes of, if there is a big tree, then the big tree prevents the growth of other big trees very close to it, right? Because of natural logistical reasons. So So if you have an orchard or a forest, and if you want to model the locations of big trees, it is reasonable to postulate that the big trees will follow a spatial pattern, point pattern, which is going to have some degree of repulsion, and you want to model them. So, and let me give one last example from biological data. So this is more technical. I cannot sort of give you, like off the cuff heuristic argument as to why it should be the case. But there has been a lot of research on, let's say, also one particular example is the distribution of photoreceptor cells in the eyes of birds, because birds have extremely strong eyesight. So photoreceptor cells in the eyes in the retina retinal configuration of birds, and it has been found that they have spatially repelling point pattern. And this is all related to the study of this hyperuniformity, which has gained popularity in statistical physics as well as condensed matter physics literature. And you can follow up, you can look at if you're interested in that direction, you can take a look at the works by Salvatore Torquato and his colleagues. They even have an article in Quanta magazine describing all these biological applications. Okay. So anyway, so all these discussions were trying to impress upon you that there indeed are situations where it is natural to posit a certain degree of repulsion between the spatial point pattern you are modeling, and using a determinantal model is very reasonable in such a situation. And in fact, a lot of work has has been done in that direction. So these are some of the names who have worked on this topic of using determinantal probability measures as a statistical model to model spatial point patterns in spatial statistics. However, a robust parametric model with naturally interpretable parameter modulation is quite lacking. So I would like to compare this to the situation in classical statistics, let's say in Stats 101 or 102, depending on the school. We are introduced to exponential family models, and these are extremely powerful, right? I mean, they are simple, but they pack a lot of expressive power. Or in the world of stochastic networks, you can think of exponential random graph models, or ERGMs. They also, pretty reasonably simple, at least simple to describe models, which also pack a lot of expressive power. So what we are thinking of is something along those lines. So of course, if you think of exponential random graph models and stochastic networks, the possible stochastic networks is the space of networks is big, and there can be various complicated probability distributions you can put on it. ERGMs are relatively simple. They are characterized by a small number of parameters, and yet they can, they can model various phenomena you can see in real world networks. So we are looking for something like that. Now you can say that, well, determinantal processes, there is already a kernel in there, and the process is completely determined by this kernel. So in principle, it's a parametric model in some sense, right? But the point is that the caveat is that this kernel it's essentially an infinite dimensional parameter. So if you are looking at a determinantal process on the continuum, then your kernel K is some kind of an operator, and it's an infinite dimensional object. If you are looking at in the discrete setting, then yes, the kernel, you can in principle think of it as a matrix, but this matrix will have the dimension of your universal ground set, which is usually huge. So for all practical purposes, it's an infinite dimensional parameter. And so what we want is something which is closer to the more in flavor, closer in spirit to the more classical, the parametric models from more classical statistics, which is that the number of parameters should be small, and we should be able to kind of modulate this parameter at will in a simple interpretable way, and this should give us some interesting implications in terms of the spatial distribution of the point, the spatial pattern of the points. So that's our goal. And a parametric model, if we can design a good one, will be a testing ground to understand how the spatial behavior of the points responds to modulation in the kernel. And this can, in principle, lead to newer applications and even stronger models. So it's understood that that a determinantal process is completely characterized by its kernel. So if you modulate the kernel, your distribution changes, but the relationship between the point process, the point pattern, and the kernel is highly implicit. It's baked inside this determinant, which is a highly nonlinear function. So if I say that, let's say I perturb the kernel by a little bit, okay, so let's say change some of the eigenvectors of the kernel, for instance, then how do my points change? Okay, so this is not clear, not easy to understand, and we want to build a parametric model where actually these kind of things are much more interpretable. Okay, so this is overall the kind of overall goal, overall agenda. So to this end, we propose the model of Gaussian determinantal processes, or GDPs. So this is joint work with Philippe Rigollet from a few years ago. We know Gaussian determinantal process, and no wonder the Gaussian again comes to our rescue. So it is indexed by the space of positive definite matrices of a given dimension, which we will call the scattering matrix, partly as a hat tip to the close connections between DPPs and quantum physics. And it is also connected to the spiked models of random matrices and spiked PCA. So I'll discuss those connections soon. And it has dimensions, it has applications to dimension reduction and clustering. And it also kind of leads to new kinds of random matrix phenomena based on truncated covariance matrices, leading to novel spectral asymptotics and connections with free probability. So I'll describe some of the ingredients here in the next few slides. Okay. First I must tell you what is a Gaussian determinantal process and how does it kind of fit at least some of the how does it fit at least some of the bullet points in the sort of the charter that I posted in a couple of slides ago. As we already discussed, a DPP is specified by its kernel. So in order to give you this parametric family of DPPs, I need to give you a family of kernels, which is parameterized by a relatively small number of parameters. So our kernel is going to be actually the Gaussian density. Now, in the space. Now, of course, it's a bit risky to use the word density here because here we are not using the Gaussian density as a density. It's just being used as a kernel function, and it's indexed by this matrix sigma. And we do not want to call it a covariance matrix because eventually we will consider a stochastic point pattern which will have its own covariance, which has no relation with this sigma. So we call this sigma as the scattering matrix. Okay. And this sigma is there for the parameter. Okay. And the mean density of points is just kxx. And notice that by construction, so this is a point process that will live on Euclidean space of dimensions. D-dimensional Euclidean space. And notice that kxy is actually a function of x minus y. So this means that the kernel is translation invariant. And therefore, from there, it's actually quite easy to show that the generated point pattern from this DPP is also going to be spatially invariant. Which is actually, which is actually a reasonable property to ask for. If you have a fairly universal model, then then the properties of this model should not depend on where you have fixed your origin of coordinates. So this is a pretty reasonable and common argument in physics. So what is the mean density of points? The mean density of points is kxx because if you remember, our first intensity is the probability that x belongs to your point process, or let's say x belongs to your DPP, and that's kxx, right? Because it's a determinant of a 1 cross 1 matrix, and that's kxx. So the mean density of points is kxx. So you put y equal to x here, and you immediately see that exponential vanishes, and you get this as the density. Okay. Generally speaking, we want to do, we have a parametric model, so we want to do parameter estimation and inference and so on. So we need to have an observation model, and our observation model is very simple. So we look at some domain in space, reasonably large domain, and we look at the points of the process which are realized within this domain. Okay. Yes.
yesterday's lecture, so maybe I'm missing something basic, but given a point X, what's the probability of finding a point Y? So this probability distribution, this kernel is maximized at X equal to Y.
No. This is not a probability. This is exactly what I am.
I understand, but the kernel is, so how should I read off the probability from the kernel?
Oh, that's the.
You maybe explained it in the beginning, which I missed. Yeah, if you could, yeah.
So that's what I discussed yesterday, and also I mentioned at the beginning of, in the reminder part today. So let's see.
So,
yes.
Okay.
So these are the m-point correlation functions. So these are the joint probabilities of having points at specified locations, alpha 1 up to alpha n. And it is given by this determinant.
I see. So even if the kernel is maximized at X equal to Y, this can still model a repulsive interaction even with positive sigma. Like the sigma you had there was positive, right?
Yeah, positive.
So even there, so that's, I see. Okay. The other question I had was maybe something I didn't understand. You explained that you went to this Gaussian process because
there is no Gaussian process.
Sorry, not the Gaussian process. You went to this Gaussian, Gaussian kernel. And that's because it's hard to parameterize general kernels. Is that the point?
I mean, okay. If I ask you to give me a kernel, what kernel? What is the first kernel you are going to?
Well, I'm a field theorist. I would have used some Chella and Lemon kind of spectral representation to write down some general.
Well, you know, maybe that will give you a good kernel. We don't know. But Gaussian kernel is a it has a lot of expressive power. For example, all these it's essentially the RBF kernel, right, in statistical learning.
I see.
So it has a lot of heritage in statistical learning that way. This is one, and in statistics in general. Number two is that it's also it also, in terms of tools and techniques, it also brings into play these all these techniques from Gaussian Fourier analysis, which actually will help us in obtaining some of our. So, for example, our because it's a parametric model, we would at some point we would like to estimate the sigma from data, and our estimator of sigma was essentially derived using some computations using Gaussian Fourier.
I see. Okay, I mean, this is the structure that's called a generalized free field in the physics literature, right? Because
So, of course, Gaussian fields are all over the physics.
No, but this is a generalized free field, very specifically where n-point functions are products of 2-point functions. Everything is determined by 2-point
product of 2-point functions. It's a determinant.
Not a product. It's a determinant because you get permutations, but it's determined by 2-point functions. So n-point.
It's determined by two, kind of, almost. I mean, if you just observe these correlations, what you will get is not kxy itself, but you will get kxy squared. So,
thanks.
Yeah, but as I alluded to in last day's lecture, so actually determinant processes originate from physics, and the basic story starts from Slater determinants. So that's where this structure was first kind of recorded, and then then it has taken a life of its own. And okay, so okay. So now we want to study parametric modulation in this model, and this will also contain another angle in response to the question you asked, which is why Gaussian kernel, because I will show you a certain kind of parametric modulation of sigma, which has a very clearly interpretable implication in terms of the spatial point pattern here also. Okay. So our goal is to interpret what is the stochastic implication of varying or modulating the parameter sigma in the space of D cross D positive definite matrices. Now notice that we want to do it in a way which which is kind of substantial. So let's say if I kind of do a modulation which kind of blows up the density of points by a factor of 2, or maybe makes the points rarer, scales down the density of points by a factor of 3, then those are like, in some sense, what we would call trivial transformations, because this change in density is easy to estimate just by looking at the average density of points. So what we will do is that we will kind of mod out by those simple modulations. So because the average density of points is 1 over the square root of determinant of sigma, therefore doing any modulation on the parameter sigma such that determinant of sigma changes will lead to a change in the mean density of points and can be detected simply by estimating the average density from the observed points. Okay, so these are kind of what we would like to think of as the trivial transformations of the model, and our parametric modulation should be more substantial in the sense that we should precisely mod out by those trivial transformations and look at only modulations which keep this determinant unchanged. Okay, so we will focus on parametric modulation that leaves the determinant sigma invariant, and in terms of spatial geometry, you can think of it as shear mappings or shear transformations. Okay, so that's what we are doing. We are taking the space and doing some kind of a shear transformation on it. Okay. So let us now further specialize to a key family of such shear transformations, which is which are in the form of a spiked model in the space of PD in the space of sigma. So how so? So imagine that you are starting from the identity. Okay, so identity sigma equal to identity means it's totally isotropic. The kernel of your DBP will be like a rotation invariant Gaussian kernel. So in particular, it will be because the kernel is rotationally invariant, your DBP, your spatial point pattern, the distribution is also rotationally invariant. So that's the situation of isotropy, in some sense, perfect harmony or lack of structure in some sense. And what you want to do is that you want to break that symmetry. And you want to break that symmetry by introducing a direction, introducing a special direction in which you have a skew. So that's your direction of shear. But we want to keep the determinant of sigma unchanged. So what you do is, and if we did not do anything else but just introduce the shear factor in the direction of the unit vector u, that would make the determinant to be 1 plus u. But we want to keep the determinant unchanged, so we compensate for that factor by distributing the effect, the determinantal effect of this the shear factor uniformly across all the other directions. Okay. So this is the natural notion of spike model in this setting. And as we already alluded to from the other direction, if you put lambda equal to 0, you get sigma equal to identity, which is the isotropic model with no directional structure. Sigma bigger than 0 corresponds to a spiked model, and the name spiked model is chosen specifically to have some kind of have the sort of arouse the memory of spiked models of random matrices and spiked PCA. So if lambda is strictly positive, this corresponds to the spiked model that introduces directional bias in the strength of the dependency structure. Okay, and the dependence, in this case repulsion between the points, is much stronger and is, for example, is much more long ranged on the scale of 1 plus lambda in the direction of the spike. And in the directions orthogonal to the spike, the dependency is is much weaker, and at relatively short length scales, it decouples to almost independent behavior. Okay, so you are making the dependency very strong in one direction, and compensate the dependency is becoming weaker in the other. Okay, so this is the spiked model that we are going to think about, and I'll tell you very soon what all we can do with it. So because it's a parametric model, our first interest in general for the general GDP would be to try to estimate the sigma. And using Gaussian Fourier analysis, we can propose an estimator for sigma, which is of this form. So you would notice that these capital V's, these are balls of various radii, and the absolute value of a ball is just the volume. So these are essentially constants. Okay, the small r is a parameter which we will come to very soon. But the key part is actually printed in red here. This is the part. This is a sum of rank 1 matrices based on pairwise differences. And we only sum over those pairs which are shorter than a particular threshold. So what threshold we are coming to soon, but this is the basic. So this is somehow the meat of the matter. And you can actually, for the purposes that we are going to use the sigma hat, you can actually throw out these other things most of the time and just focus on this, and this will actually contain most of the useful information. Okay. So you can do a bias variance trade-off, and you can find so this R actually depends on N and D. So you can do a bias variance trade-off, and you can find the optimal, you can propose a prescription for the optimal choice of R to be square root of d log n. And what can we do with this model? So, for example, if what can we do with this estimator sigma hat? So, for example, you can look at the spiked model, and you can try to consider the problem of estimating. You can try to consider the problem of testing whether there is a spike or whether the data is actually isotropic, and all the lack of isotropy is just noise. So you can test that, and actually you can look at the maximal eigenvalue and the maximal eigenvector of sigma hat, this matrix, which allows and using these. Based on these, you can construct tests of hypotheses which allow for detection of anisotropic direction with high probability if the spike size is above a certain threshold, lambda n comma d. And in our work, we propose a bound for lambda n and d, which we are completely sure can be improved, but this is the first bound. And if you remember, the famous BBP phase transition in spiked models of random matrices and its connections with spiked PCA, you get results of similar flavor. Of course, those are situations of complete independence. The matrices are just covariance matrices, so it's a much simpler situation, and everything is understood and can be analyzed to a much greater detail. Whereas this subject is more in its starting phase. But clearly there are fairly deep connections to the wider literature in random matrix theory, and it can, and as I shall show in the next few slides, it can actually lead to very interesting results in random matrix theory itself. And if you notice, so for example, what I was trying to say is that if you look at this piece, which is the localized sum of pairwise. Which is a localized sum of rank 1 matrices based on pairwise neighbors of pairwise points which are in some neighborhood. If you look at this kind of object, and if you let R go to infinity and you take all pairs of points, not which are kind of in some local neighborhood of each other, then actually you would get the covariance matrix, sample covariance matrix. So in some sense, what we are looking at is our truncated covariance matrices, truncated sample covariance matrices, and more generally, so you can write this truncation. Here. So you can write this as a sum over all pairs, but then you introduce an indicator, a cutoff. So this is the truncating indicator cutoff function. And you can easily see from here how this will generalize. So you can first replace it with some other cutoff, and more generally, you can replace it by some kernel k of xi xj, no relation to any DBP, just this is just a kernel k. You can replace the k by psi if it helps. So you can look at kernelized sample covariance matrices like this, following this suggestion, and actually analyzing them leads to various interesting spectral asymptotics that I will come to in one of the later slides. Yes. What? Yeah. So of course, it depends. It depends on R, and this R can depend on N and D, and something else if you want. So this is a very general model. So I'll move to the slide. So yeah, thank you. Okay. So I'll come to these in a few slides. But let us first discuss a little bit as to what kind of applications these kind of spiked models of Gaussian determinantal processes can have. So the overall idea is that these models or these answers, they are very useful for determining if there is a clear significant directional bias in the data. And because the overall model is repulsive, overall stochastic model is repulsive, therefore it is naturally geared towards capturing situations or capturing applications where along this significant direction, the particles or the points, your data points, they have a tendency to repel each other. So what would be such examples? So let me again, no need to move the camera, so I'll just draw a quick picture. So suppose you have a situation with clustered data, okay? So here are two clustered points. So in this kind of data, there is actually a significant direction, which is the direction of the line joining the 2 points, the centers of the 2 clusters, right? And you can imagine that you can imagine the elements or the points in these 2 clusters as particles which repel each other. There are 2 varieties of particles which are repelling each other. So they are trying to move away from each other to infinity, but there is a confining potential which prevents them from flying off to infinity. So then they, again, as usual in DPPs, they cannot move too close, they cannot move too far. So these 2 particles, so the only kind of equilibrium solution is that these particles equilibrate in 2 blobs, 1 blob for each type of particle, okay? So this is a way to conceptually think about clustered data in terms of interacting particle systems, okay? And this is the intuition, this is the heuristic that we will use when we will use this spiked model as an answers to analyze clustered data. Okay, so let us see what this answers allows us to do. So the problem of dimension reduction and the problem of detecting directionality in data are closely related. Yes?
Excuse me, sorry, just something that's bothering me. Is one way to think about this in the physics language just as a set of free fermions, as a free fermion gas?
Yes.
Would that be and so should I think of this clustered data as 2 species of like fermions? I have
I think 2 species is more reasonable because you have to also explain why this blob exists and it doesn't shatter.
I see. So we think of some free fermion field theory with like 2 species, and that gives us exactly the 2-point function that you had. And
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So in this slide, what I am going to try to argue to you is that the problem of dimensionality reduction and the problem of detecting directionality data are closely related. And in turn, dimension reduction is closely related to the kind of problems we discussed here because there is a significant direction which captures this is the one dimension of the data is really one dimension. If you project all your points along this direction, you will essentially not lose any information, right? So solving this clustering problem is really a game of finding this direction. So in some sense, it's the key point is dimension reduction. So in principal component analysis, which is one of the major workhorses of dimension reduction, we are interested in the directions of maximal variability, okay? The directions which maximize variance in the data, which are obtained by taking the principal eigendirections of the empirical covariance matrix of the data. But we may view the problem more generally, the problem of finding the significant directions in data more generally, and we can find these significant directions by finding the optimal directions with respect to some other feature as opposed to variance. So you can take the PCA based methods and replace variance by some other feature. So if you replace variance, for example, by the strength of correlation or repulsion, you are naturally led to something like a determinantal model. So in particular, we use the GDP model as an answers for proposing a dimension reduction methodology with particular view towards clustered data, because this is the kind of application we want to think about in this setting. So what we do is very simple. If you give me any data points, x1, x2, xn, I can compute that sigma hat, which was there on the slide a few slides ago, because it's just a matrix. And then what we do is that we perform SVD and project the data points onto the principal eigendirections of sigma hat. So in particular, the idea is that if there is one principal direction, like here, then the topmost eigenvector of sigma hat should capture this. Okay, so this is the famous Fisher's IRIS data set. So there are 3 varieties of points, black, red, and blue, and you want to separate them. So black is always, in usual methods, is generally very clearly separated from the red and the green. Separating the red and the green, that's the hard part. So this is PCA-based method, and this is Gaussian determinantal process-based method, and you see that more or less, the performance is better. In fact, we can plot some ROC curves, and we get a better result. Okay. So this is ansatz. This is just implementation. So what about theoretical substantiation? So this is joint work in progress with Dong, Mukherjee, and Talukdar, where we obtain minimax optimal guarantees for GDP-based clustering algorithms. One aspect which I would like to emphasize is that because of the structure of these matrix, so this is the heart of the matter in some sense in sigma hat, because it is a function first of all of the difference of the 2 points. So you do not need to know the exact identities of the points, and moreover you need to have only local access. Okay, so this is a certain feature of this estimator which can be useful if you want to, if you are allowed, in a real data situation, you might not always have like full access to all the data. Instead, maybe the data you are getting based on only, based on some data collection experiment, and you have, maybe you have only limited and local access to the data and the people want to anonymize it in a certain way. So this has some of those features. Yeah. So yes. So these are of interest, and recently there has been some work in the direction. But I mean, that theory, that aspect of the theory is still in development. Whereas for the one category version of in your parlance, so that's there is a clear correspondence with the fermionic literature, and you can use many things directly.
I mean, with the 2 categories also there would be, but you seem to be saying that you can understand this clustering even using 1 species somehow.
Yes, maybe with 2 species it can be even better, but with 1 already we are getting this. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I have one more question. So in your last slide, you said that, okay, please go to the last slide. You said that you have minimax optimal guarantee. So what does that mean actually? And since you said minimax optimal, I assume that it's better than something that was there for.
No, minimax optimal, I mean, yes. I mean, you cannot beat it.
So I guess what I'm asking is that when you take minimax, then what is the mini over?
No, sure. I'm not stating a theorem. I'm just giving you a flavor of the kind of result that is possible. So it's minimizing the maximum risk, right? And the minimum is over. So for example, recently there have been papers about minimax optimality of PCA-based clustering. So you use PCA to find the maximal, find the direction and project onto it and do the clustering there. So so this result we can match it. This matches to the leading order. Our belief is that if you go to the second order, this method will be better, and that's what you are seeing in this figure, because determinantal estimates based on determinantal processes are usually more stable. So our belief is that the second order behavior will be better, but it's I mean, I don't know of any paper which has computed the second order rates in any complicated scenario, certainly not for clustering. Okay, so to the leading order we can match the state of the art, and our belief is that the second order is better, but we are not making any claims of. Okay, so here are the kernelized sample covariance matrices that I alluded to here. So your k beta is the psi of R here, and the beta is going to be a function of n and d, like here. And typically your beta is a function of some kind of, is some scalar function of some kind of distance. So here, for example, the scalar would be an indicator, but some kind of distance between x and y. So one example would be the indicator kernel. The other could be the Gaussian kernel, which is like a smoothing of the indicator kernel, and you can look at various other variations. So what is the kind of results that we can expect? So depending on the regularity properties of the kernel, k beta, and by the way, this we are using this we are using our word kernel here because that's the kind of that's the terminology which is used in this part of the statistical literature. There is no relation with the determinantal kernel. We investigated our first work on this, which is what I'm going to discuss in the next slide. So there we are looking at the sort of the ground, sort of the base case scenario where the xi's are sampled IID from some distribution. Okay, so there is no cluster, and you want to understand the behavior. So you want to, so in some sense, if you are first, even before detecting the clusters, you're trying to detect the clusters. Suppose you are trying to test the hypothesis that whether the data is really clustered or whether the apparent clusters are just a function of noise, an artifact of noise. You want to test that hypothesis. So then your null hypothesis would be that the data points are sampled independently, IID, from some distribution. So you're looking at that situation, and there, depending on the regularity properties of the kernel k beta, which kind of is modulates the interaction between these pairs xi and xj, different asymptotic spectral laws can be established in the setting where the xi's are IID. For smooth kernels, again, smoothness in a suitable class, it converges to a shifted and scaled family of Marchenko-Pastur type laws. And for non-smooth kernels, we can prove convergence to a more complicated spectral asymptotics that is characterized implicitly by an equation on the Stieltjes transform. Okay, and the crucial issue here is the dependence between the coefficients or the kernels or interaction kernel k beta of xi and xj. Sorry, this should be I, and the rank 1 matrix xi minus xj transpose. So there has been some work on this kind of truncated or kernelized sample covariance matrices with this kind of structure. But when these interactions, these interaction kernels, they are just constants. So they are just some aij's, but aij's are non-random. Or maybe they are random, but they're independent of the xi's and xj. But here, they are precisely dependent on xi and xj, and why is it natural to consider this kind of kernels, where interaction kernels? Well, we saw some examples here already. So this opens the door to new kinds of random matrix theory results. And if you want, I can actually write down this equation on the Stieltjes transform. It's an implicit equation. It's a kind of, we can show that in a certain regime of the parameter, this equation has a unique solution, and that characterizes the limiting spectral law. Okay. Okay. And before we close, and before I discuss some ingredients, let's say maybe I'll discuss the determinantal sampler on the board. Let me just spend a couple of slides on a very different kind of interacting particle systems in the context of machine learning. These are not determinantal processes, but they arise naturally in signal processing. And exploiting the strongly correlated nature, the hyperuniformity of these particle systems, signal processing methodology have been devised in the recent years. And they seem to be, in particular, they can address certain kinds of challenging signal processing problems coming from physics, which I think kind of raises the possibility of a different kind of application. So let me spend a couple of slides on that. So a very different kind of strongly correlated random point field or a random particle system, which is very different from deterministal processes, are the zeros of Gaussian power series. So here you look at this power series. Your Z is the complex variable, and your xik's are IID Gaussians. Okay, and you look at this power series. You have a specific scaling with square root k factorial. Of course, it helps in making everything converge all over the complex plane in an entire as an entire function and so on. But this is but you know, there is more to it, and the square root k factorial has a deep physical connotation, which is from where it originates. So I'll not dwell much on that because we only will spend let's say 5 minutes on this. But it arises in the study of quantum chaotic eigenstates, and the key names there are the French School of Physics, Bogomolny, Bohigas, Lebeuf, Nonenmacher, Voros, etc. And in terms of in the context of signal processing, it captures the distribution of the zeros of the short time Fourier transform of white noise. So what is a short time Fourier transform? So we all know what the Fourier transform is, very important in signal processing. So it is something like this, right? Now this can have some stability issues because this exponent is highly oscillatory. So what you can do is that you can actually kind of modulate it by introducing a cutoff here. So you introduce some cutoff V at some center x naught, and you stick it inside the integration. So this V could be a Gaussian, for instance, just to give you an idea. And then this will become a function of psi or x naught and psi. Okay. So this is the short time Fourier transform, and it is it is popular in a certain kind of signal processing, especially with audio and generally acoustic signals. This is par for the course, and it goes under the name of time frequency analysis. So roughly this is time and this is frequency. Now from here you can take these variables and look at it as a function of the complex variable. Okay. And then you can think of the short time Fourier transform as a function on the complex plane. Okay. So now, of course, we are in signal processing. So the most basic question is whether there is a signal at all or whether it is pure noise. So you want to distinguish, you want to test between pure noise and signal plus noise. Okay. So you need to understand what happens under the null hypothesis, which is what happens when there is pure noise. And the natural model of pure noise in this, the most basic one in this setting is white noise. So if you take Gaussian white noise, and then if you take the short time Fourier transform, you can look at it as a function on the complex plane. And the zeros of that short STFT on the complex plane of white noise are essentially the zeros of this. They are the same. The distribution of the zeros of the short time Fourier transform of white noise, which is a point process, a random point set on the complex plane, is the same. It is identically distributed as the zeros of this random object. And this is not to say that this equals the short time Fourier transform of white noise, that it doesn't. But the zeros have the same distribution. And if there was time, or if there was, let's say, a lecture dedicated to this topic, one can, in like 10 minutes, one can compute. I can compute and convince you that this should be the case. It's a very nice complex analysis computation. Now, what is this good for? So the idea is that the zeros of this complex function, they form a strongly correlated particle system with similar repulsive properties as, let's say, a deterministal process or as a fermionic system. So this means that if you look at the zeros of pure noise, or the zeros of the STFT of pure noise, they will basically look like a very homogeneous spatial distribution like this, okay? It's almost like you take a grid and you noise the points a little bit, and that's what you will get. However, when there is signal, what will happen is that in this kind of spatially homogeneous sea of zeros, there will arise an island which is basically free of zeros. And that to you is the indication that there is signal. It's not pure noise, okay? And we want to process the signal. We want to detect if there is a signal, or we want to, next step, we want to reconstruct the signal on the basis of detecting these islands, okay? So that's the idea, and in the last 10 years, it has gained popularity. So one of the key names is the French signal processing school led by Patrick Flandrin and his co-authors, his school. So here is an example of how a signal plus noise spectrogram looks like. So these white points are the zeros of the spectrogram. If there was no signal and pure white noise, then they would be distributed like homogeneously over this square. But there is signal because this is the signal. This is the BAT echolocation signal data. So there is non-trivial signal, and these signals basically generate these islands which are devoid of noise. And signal processing basically and because for pure white noise the distribution of points is so spatially rigid, any deviation like this is easy to detect. And in particular, because we have reduced the signal processing problem to a problem of identifying structure in point sets, therefore, and these are all two-dimensional point sets, by the way, because we are working on the complex plane. Therefore, these point sets are highly amenable to very powerful methods from topological data analysis. And this allows us to do signal detection as well as signal reconstruction in a wide class of time index problems, in particular in the setting of gravitational waves, because this is known to be a very challenging signal processing problem, and even just to detect gravitational waves is hard. And there is there are competitions which are held for coming up with new methods to crunch gravitational wave data and just to detect signals. So here we can even reconstruct signals in certain regimes of noise, okay, for gravitational waves. So this can actually, so we are working with more applied people on further follow-up from here in order to make this method more robust and applicable to bigger regimes of noise. Okay. Okay, good. So this kind of brings me to the end of the discussions. So maybe I'll take the remaining 10 minutes to discuss a little bit about the sampling. Yes. So, so how does a determinant sampler works? And the reason for choosing this particular topic is that it captures many of the nice structure and the geometry of determinantal processes, the spatial geometry of determinantal point processes, which is the basic reason of why it works in the first place. Okay, so let us do a quick sampler. So let us imagine we are selecting just one point. So we are doing a determinantal process. Our kernel is rank 1. It's a projection kernel. Our kernel is rank 1. So there is just one particle we expect to choose. Now, what is the probability? So what is the probability that this is your point is x, that is kx, okay? And since we know that there is going to be one point, all that we need to do is to, and imagine that this is, let's say, on the line or in some space, and all that you need to do is that you need to go and pick a point according to this probability. Okay. So that's just picking a 1-point problem, no random sets, easy. So now let us graduate from 1 point to 2 points. So what is the probability that both X and Y belong? So this is the 2-point determinant, right? Okay. Now, so here we will, here there is something more interesting going on. So what we will do is that we will draw that parallelogram which was there on the slide before it switched. So suppose this is X. So suppose X is represented by a vector Vx, and this is Vy. Okay. And imagine, and in fact, I mean, in some sense, you can choose Vx and Vy rigorously so that this is the case. Imagine that this matrix is just, this matrix is just the inner product is the Gram matrix of Vx and Vy. Okay. Okay. So of course, since this is positive definite, so you can do this. And then, what is the determinant of the Gram matrix? That has a very clear interpretation. So what you do is that you draw this, you complete this parallelogram, and you take the volume of this parallelogram, and you square the volume. Okay. So this is this determinant. Okay. So you want to pick a point which is proportional to the square of this volume. Okay. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we want to pick the point one by one. So first we want to pick the first point, and then we want to pick the second point. And we are looking at the situation where we are eventually end up picking the points X and Y. So we are just going to unpack how we can unpack a procedure for selecting X and then Y so that the total probability is this. So how do we do that? Well, the first point, no issues. We go and pick X with this probability. Okay, so it's we pick X with probability kxx, and this is known to us because the kernel is known. And then to pick Y, if you were doing independent sampling, what you would do is that these kernels, so these off-diagonal terms would not be there. And what you would do is that you just will go and pick Y with probability kyy and be done. But here it's not independent, it is entangled. And in order to unpack that entanglement, what we will do is that we will draw the perpendicular . We will drop the perpendicular here and look at the projection of Vy onto the orthogonal complement of Vx. Okay, so let's call this Vy perp. Okay, and then what you do is that, so now if you forget the X and in some sense the contribution of Vx to this entire thing, you just focus on the orthogonal complement, you are reduced to this Vy perp, and you treat it as if you were picking a fresh determinantal point from a one-dimensional distribution. So you just pick Y with probability. Okay, with probability what? So let's come to it in a moment. But before that, we have to unpack what kxx is. In terms of Vx, kxx is just norm of Vx squared. So then we will pick y with probability, and remember now we are totally in the orthogonal complement. We have modded out all influence from x, so we are in the orthogonal complement. So we can only see Vy perp. So we pick y with probability Vy perp square. And so the total probability, and because it is rank 2, so there are only 2 points to pick, so total probability equal to Px squared for the first point, Vy perp for the second point, and that's it. Okay. So now, and you know this scales. So if it is a R dimensional or M dimensional kernel, because you want an M size sample, what you do is that you pick the first point according to K, then you project everything to the orthogonal complement of the vector of your picked point. And then everything from there on happens in this orthogonal complement. So you look at all these projected vectors for all the other possible points, and you do a determinant sampling of m-1 points in that orthogonal complement. Okay, and basically by construction, I mean this is by construction. So this is equal to so this is Vx times Vy perp square, and Vx norm of Vx times norm of Vy perp is precisely, you can do your basic Euclidean school geometry, and this is precisely the volume of the parallelepiped generated by Vx and Vy. Okay, and this is the key idea, and you know you can extend this to yes. Yes, I mean, okay, but then I have to explain should complement. I should. So, yes. So, as Andrea pointed out, so the only remaining business is that if you look at, so you know, when you do this projection, what you need for the next steps of your sampling is to compute these complements, compute these orthogonal projections, which are you know, which is essentially linear algebra. And in fact, so there is 1.5 minutes left. So in fact, what it does is that what all of these entails in general is that you pick x according to with probability kxx, and now you project everything to the orthogonal complement of the vector of x, Vx. Now, of course, when you are doing the sampling, you do not want to do this geometry every time. So you want to reduce everything to linear algebra. So the way to pack everything in terms everything the way to pack all of this together and express it in terms of linear algebra is that now look at universal sets or the ground set minus x, because x you have already picked, and the condition, the DPP with kernel K conditioned on x belonging to the DPP, x belonging to sample, is another DPP with a different kernel K tilde of x as a function of x, and this K tilde, which is a function of x, is simply K minus it's a rank 1 perturbation. So this is exactly the rank 1 perturbation, rank 1 update to K, and you pick point Y according to the probability Kx of Y comma Y, and then so on. And then you do this rank 1 update again now on the kernel X with regard to the new point Y, and you go on. And essentially, this is the Schur complement. Yeah, I mean, so the translation is that when you look at K, so Kxy is, you should think of it like an inner product. So when you think of any quantity like Kzz, it's the squared norm of something. Yeah, so that's the dictionary. Yeah, so this is the spectral geometric algorithm, and of course. And the key point about these more advanced algorithms which are faster is that you note that if you are working with a kernel whose rank is R, the point is that R is the true dimension of the problem in that sense. So everything should be expressible in an R dimensional space, and everything should scale according to that. So what they have done, what these papers which I cited which have come out in the last 2-3 years, they have done is that they have at a very high level, what they are doing is that they're doing this bookkeeping carefully and efficiently enough so that they can squeeze the maximum advantage out of the fact that if you have a kernel of rank R, then the problem essentially lives in an R dimensional space. Yes.
So here you know a priori the number of samples you want to pick from this DPP distribution, right?
Yeah, so that's usually the case, right? You want to have control on that, typically.
Okay, but if you want like a general version where anything is fine, then first you have to sample for like
yeah. But that is like you can build that on top of
this sample.
Yeah.
Okay.
Slightly broader question. Rather than just thinking of these free fermions, the next natural thing one could do is think of adding some higher point correlators.
Yes.
So that an n-point correlator doesn't just break up into determinant of 2 point ones, but there are higher order terms that you would get with Wick's theorem. That's a very natural thing to do in terms of from a field theory point of view.
Right.
Is that useful at all? I mean, to think.
Well, you can always consider this. Okay, so this is different from the speciation example, right? So yeah, so this is not clear to me.
Fundamental 3-point or 4-point interactions.
Right.
Rather
so
than 2-point, yeah.
This, I mean, in principle, yes, because you see, in some sense, the richer your model is, the more expressive it gets, right? The point is that with determinantal process, there are these clean sampling algorithms which can reduce everything to linear algebra and so on.
This is, I think, just a question of getting the state. We understand the state of the fermions that gives us the right sampling.
No, but the point is
yeah.
that when you try to generate samples from this new distribution, whether you can reduce everything efficiently to this kind of linear algebraic computations. So if it can, then then potentially it can have.
I think so, right? Because the place these 3-point interactions come from in physics is from some action, and that gives you a probability distribution. So you're sampling from that action.
Yeah, but sampling from a distribution is easier said than done, right? Okay. One has to be able to do it.
Okay, but maybe it's just not useful. But you're saying it has not been tried.
No, I think usefulness is kind of the less of the concern here a priori, from what I understand from what you described, because if you have more interaction, what can be worse? Your interaction in truth is really this kind of 2-point interactions, and then there must be a way of setting the higher order terms to have 0 coefficients in your model. So this should, in principle, this is a richer model, right? Now, no one has any objection to a richer model. The question is how manageable that is.
This is a little bit like saying somebody explains to you the Gaussian distribution and says, is there any use in going beyond Gaussian? Of course, there is use in going beyond Gaussian, but easier said than done, right?
There are no any further questions?
So what are some necessary and sufficient conditions on K that ensure that? Yeah, because you haven't mentioned.
So I think this topic came up yesterday, right? So there is a very clear understanding of that. And let me write that down. So this is a theorem that is originally goes back to Odile Machi, who is a physicist, and then more modern and technically cleaner version by Soshnikov. So what it says is that, so your kernel, you have a kernel, which is a candidate for being the kernel of a DPP, and you have the background measure mu, right, which kind of forms the base measure. So for example, typically it would be, for example, one example would be it's like Euclidean, like Lebesgue measure on Euclidean space. So anyway, there is a base measure, background measure mu. And the way you evaluate this kernel is that you think of it as an integral operator that acts on L2 of mu, okay? And the necessary and sufficient condition is that this integral operator is sandwiched between 0 and identity in the positive definite sense. That is necessary and sufficient. So you can think of it in terms of matrices, and you have a big ground set from which you are drawing samples. So your kernel will always be a matrix. So then your kernel, again, as matrices, and imagine that your background measure is just counting measure on your set. So then your matrix kernel has to be sandwiched between 0 and identity at suitable normalization.
So do you have any concentration result for GDP?
Oh, that's a, no. I mean, the concentration result that we have for DPPs is, this just came out last year. So I don't think this has been investigated in the context of GDPs, but our concentration result is for projection kernels, and GDP is not a projection kernel. So it will not follow from our result. Well, I mean, in principle it can, but then you have to, the crucial point is that you have to estimate the variance properly, and I think the variance estimation has not been taken, looked at seriously for the GDP.
Okay, thanks.
If no further questions, let's have the break and move on.